matter what evidence you place forward, what historical documents, such as Stephen Douglas being a close friend of Joseph Smith, providing him safe haven in Illinois for the entire Mormon community that first ended up in Quincy, a port on the Underground Railroad for escaping fugitive slaves, and the fact that the United States honored Emma Smith Bideman for her service in founding the Nauvoo colony out on the west to promote anti-slavery. It was the fight that ended up with Joseph Smith's assassination, but certainly the United States will honor Joseph Smith, as did Josiah Quincy state. Nobody will ever really realize the sacrifices and service that Joseph Smith gave to the United States. So I'm now responding to those who religiously believe that Joseph Smith introduced celestial polygamy when it so violates any of the human species. But again, I guess the Mormon celestial kingdom is for those who are non-human, right? Because polygamy only exists under the threat of violence or death, as we see in the fundamentalist communities or the deaf communities of Saudi Arabia, where women can be murdered in their fathers' swimming pools. Yes, Utah men, not a shining example of the human species. So let's listen to my better voice, speaking my language and responding to another man who so wishes that there's polygamy in heaven, even though it was considered outdated in the 19th century and continues in every civilized country to be outlawed, except for now Utah and Saudi Arabia.
However, why is it so difficult to believe there are a few men who might be totally dedicated to their wives and have no interest in sexual mischief? There are plenty of other Smiths to point at, such as William Smith and Lucy Smith Milliken, who was married to a Cochranite leader. Smith's family were intermarried with Cochranites, Saco, Maine, so Smith siblings may have dabbled in this alternative lifestyle of wife swapping based on the religion of Jacob Cochrane, who the Smiths knew from Dartmouth College. Perhaps there were a few of Smith's siblings appear to have engaged in spiritual wafery or wife swapping, such as William Smith and perhaps Lucy Smith Milliken. Samuel Smith converted these Cochranites, who moved as a voting bloc to Kirtland, Ohio, and Joseph welcomed them because they voted against slavery. Joseph had little interest in their and other communities' alternative marriage practices, which were widespread during the 19th century. During 1943 and 1944, Joseph was fighting desperately to save his life from assassination from Missouri vigilantes. He had no interest in secret heavenly marriage except to calm the Cochranites down. My theory is that Joseph had a genetic issue called the XXY chromosome, making him infertile as well as a low libido. XXY are barrel-chested, wide-hipped creative men who are gentle giants and extremely bright. Joseph fits this XXY type perfectly. Also, there may have been an Rh blood incompatibility between Joseph and Emma, resulting her many stillborn children. I believe all his children were adopted from friends who were widowers and needed a home for their motherless children. Most of Joseph's children are first named after his best friends whose wives had died. I have as much evidence for my theories as you do for Joseph writing the silly DC 132, which is so obviously authored by Sidney Rigdon and polished up later by Orson Pratt. Joseph did not write in such highfalutin style, such as calling women virgins, which they were not since most were married when he was allegedly sealed to them. Polygamy only lasts at the point of a gun, and so unless you become murder incorporated, such as the Brighamites, polygamy never lasts. Unfortunately, like geese, humans mate for life in the natural order of things. Polygamists in Saudi Arabia and in Utah fundamentalism must use the threat of violence to keep men and women in line. Plenty of murderous fundamentalists are doing this, but it leaves human devastation. My theory is Joseph was more concerned with anti-slavery, Whig Party than in an alternative marriage system. But believe what you will. I think Joseph had better things to do than jumping from bed to bed of married women. But again, I appreciate your point of view. I just don't agree with it.
So let's learn a little bit about Cochranism, straight out of Wikipedia. Wikipedia even calls Cochranism the precedent or the forefather of Mormon spiritual wifery. The Mormon and the Cochranite interaction is undeniably close.
Cochrane dismissed traditional concepts of marriage, citing passages in the Bible where 7 wives shared one man. As early as 1818 to 1819 the group was referring to spiritual wifery. Cochrane would assign women to the men since legal marriages were not considered valid. He would also shift these women between men as he saw fit as their prophet. It was said that about half of the women in the group were once assigned to him. Ephraim Stinchfield, Wikidata, who observed the community on a number of occasions, recorded 16 pages of abominations including unwed couples staying together, and Cochrane's habit of taking young women into private rooms for extended periods of time. After their meeting was over, I retired and spent the rest of the evening with 6 of this society, one of whom called himself an ordained minister in their society. I had now for the first time, an opportunity of inquiring into their distinguishing peculiar tenets. They, like all other enthusiasts, pretended to light superior to that of any other religious society, since the apostles, and the power of healing the sick, raising the dead, and casting out devils, all of which, they said, had been literally performed among them. Extraordinary dreams and visions, they asserted, had been experienced, and wonders wrought. They had private, sometimes dark, meetings, in which none, but such as were bound by oath, to the most inviolable secrecy, not to divulge what was transacted in the meeting, upon penalty of eternal damnation, or of having their names blotted out of the book of life, were admitted. That each brother and sister in this fraternity has a spiritual husband, wife, mate, or yoke fellow, such as they choose, or their leaders choose for them. These spiritual mates dissolve, or disannul, all former marriage connections, and many of them bed and board together, to the exclusion of all former vows. Such conduct as this had not become general, and many of them would deny that such things existed among them, though proved by the most solemn declarating of persons of undoubted veracity. I had, before I left this place, such a discovery of the mystery of iniquity, working to the subversion of all social ties, between husband and wife, parents and children, rulers and ruled, ministers and people, the rising generation corrupted by the introduction of such vicious practices, under a cloak of religion, that it seemed as if I should be constrained to run from house to house, and cry day and night, against the abomination that maketh desolate. Cochrane also was working towards a communal order where everything was held in common. However, within a few years, Cochrane was eventually convicted of gross lewdness, lascivious behavior, and adultery and spent 4 years in prison. His followers were once said to be in the thousands, but only a handful remained loyal to their prophet after his imprisonment. A few years after his release from prison, Jacob Cochrane established a colony for a portion of his followers, in what is now Grove Township, Allegheny Company, New York. This little-known group lived in close proximity, too, to several people who later became prominent members within the Latter-day Saint movement including Warren Cowdery, William Marks, and Lyman White. The first Mormon branches in Allegheny County were established in the area immediately surrounding the Cochranite colony, during the early 1830s. Cochrane has been called a John the Baptist for Mormonism by Saco Valley historian G.T. Ridlin because so many Cochranites were among those who converted to Mormonism and moved west. Citation needed. Although the Cochranites practiced a type of spiritual wifery, see above, which sanctioned multiple female partners for each man in the group, their doctrines did not include the precept of eternal marriage, and thus differed slightly from Mormon polygamy. Latter-day Saint historical sources indicate that Mormon missionaries were laboring successfully to make converts among Maine's Cochranites as early as 1832. At the church conference held in Saco, Maine on August 21, 1835, at least 7 of the newly ordained apostles were in attendance. 3. John C. Bennett, a leading Mormon who was excommunicated, is credited with introducing the Cochranite term spiritual wifery to Mormonism. Bennett's version of the multiple female partners practice appears to have more closely resembled Jacob Cochrane's doctrine than it did the precept of plural marriage among the Latter-day Saints.